What if the journey doesn't begin with a destination, but with a quiet decision to be ready? Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore a gentle moment in James and Diep's story, where a dream of travelling the world doesn't start with plane tickets or dates, but with small preparations, honest conversations, and the courage to leave space for what truly matters. If you enjoy this kind of slow, emotional storytelling, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming videos. The morning arrives quietly, almost carefully, as if it doesn't want to disturb anything. A thin layer of mist lingers outside the wooden house, wrapping the trees and the narrow path in a soft blur. Inside, the air is warm and still. James is already awake. He moves slowly, barefoot across the wooden floor, careful not to make noise. The kettle sits on the stove, water heating gradually, not rushed. This is the kind of morning that doesn't ask for decisions, it simply exists. On the table, the world map is still there. It wasn't folded away last night, not forgotten either. It lies open, edges slightly curled, small creases marking places where fingers had pressed down, paused, hesitated. James glances at it while measuring coffee grounds, then looks away again, as if he doesn't want to stare too long. Diep wakes up to the familiar sounds of morning, the faint clink of a cup, the low hiss of boiling water, the distant call of birds. She stays still for a moment, wrapped in the blanket, listening. There's a calm heaviness in her chest, not sadness, not excitement, just awareness. Last night's conversation hasn't disappeared with sleep. It's still here, settling gently into the day. She gets up and steps into the main room. The floor is cool. James looks up and smiles, the quiet kind that doesn't interrupt anything. "Morning," he says. "Morning," she replies, her voice still soft with sleep. They don't mention the map. They don't mention travel. James pours coffee into 2 cups. Diep opens the window slightly, letting in the smell of damp earth. For a few minutes they sit at the table in silence, hands wrapped around warm cups, eyes drifting between the window and the map without settling anywhere for too long. After breakfast, Diep starts tidying the shelves near the door. It's not a plan, it's just something to do with her hands. She moves books, stacks old notebooks, wipes dust from the corner where things tend to gather unnoticed. James rinses the cups, sets them upside down, then pauses. He watches her for a second before looking down again. As Diep reaches deeper into the lower cabinet, her fingers brush against something hard. She pulls it out slowly, a small suitcase. It's older than she remembers, fabric slightly faded, zipper stiff from lack of use. She sets it on the floor and kneels beside it, surprised more by the feeling than the object itself. "I forgot we still had this," she says. James dries his hands on a towel and walks over. He nods. "Yeah, it's been a while." Neither of them says when it was last used. They don't need to. Diep opens it carefully. Inside are a few things left behind: an empty notebook, a charger that no longer fits any of their devices, a folded scarf that still smells faintly like soap. She touches the fabric, then closes the suitcase again, leaving it on the floor instead of putting it away. James walks to the shelf near the window and takes down his old camera. He checks the lens, wipes it gently with his sleeve. The camera still works. It always has. He sets it on the table, beside the map, then steps back. None of this feels planned, yet everything feels connected. Later, rain begins to fall. At first, it's light, barely noticeable. Then the sound grows steadier, tapping against the roof in a slow, even rhythm. They move closer to the window, watching the drops slide down the glass, blurring the trees outside. Diep breaks the silence first. "If we really went," she says, then stops. James turns toward her. "If we really went," she nods. "What do you think you'd bring?" He doesn't answer right away. He looks around the room instead, the wooden walls, the small table, the familiar corners. Then he looks back at her. "Honestly," he says. "Not much." She smiles faintly. That's not an answer. He exhales, amused. I mean it. I think I'd want to leave more things behind than take with me. Like what? Schedules, expectations, the feeling that every day has to prove something. Deep listens carefully, not interrupting. The rain fills the pauses between his words. And you? He asks. She considers it. I think I'd want to bring time, even if that doesn't make sense. He smiles again. It does. They move back to the table. Diep takes a pen and opens the empty notebook from the suitcase. On the first page, she writes a title, then stops, thinking. What are you writing? James asks. Not places, she says quickly, as if answering a question he hasn't asked yet. I don't want to write places. He nods, relieved. She writes slowly. Things we want to feel. Things we're afraid of losing. Things we don't want to carry anymore. James leans over her shoulder, reading. He picks up another pen and adds a line under the last point. Pressure to be someone else. They sit side by side, taking turns adding small phrases. Silence stretches comfortably between them. After a while, Diep's pen stops moving. James, she says quietly. Yeah? What if we're not ready? The question hangs in the air, heavier than anything written on the page. The rain outside seems louder now. He doesn't rush to reassure her. He knows this isn't a fear that disappears with easy words. I think not being ready is part of it, he says slowly. I'm not sure anyone ever feels completely ready. She looks down at the notebook. I'm scared of leaving things unfinished. I am too. She finally looks up. Then why do you still want to go? He meets her eyes. Because I'm more scared of staying and always wondering what would have happened if we didn't. Diep closes the notebook gently. They don't make a decision. There's no agreement, no timeline, no promise spoken out loud. James folds the map carefully, smoothing the creases before placing it on the table. Diep picks it up and, after a brief hesitation, places it inside the open suitcase. They leave the suitcase unzipped. That evening the rain stops. The sky darkens early, and James turns on the lamp, filling the room with warm yellow light. Dinner is simple, nothing special, nothing rushed. They sit close, shoulders touching, comfortable in the quiet. The suitcase remains in the corner, half open, not packed, not ignored. They're still here. But something has already begun. The night settles in slowly without ceremony. Outside, the ground still smells damp from the rain, and a faint breeze moves through the trees, carrying the quiet sounds of insects waking up. Inside the wooden house, the lamp casts a soft glow that doesn't reach every corner, leaving some spaces comfortably dim. The suitcase stays where it was, half open, as if waiting but not insisting. James washes the dishes while Diep dries them, the routine familiar and grounding. Their movements are unhurried. Every clink of porcelain feels gentle, intentional. When they're done, James places the last plate on the shelf and turns off the sink. For a moment, neither of them moves. Do you ever think about the first place you wanted to go? Diep asks, breaking the quiet. James leans against the counter. Yeah, I was younger. I thought travelling meant escaping. Escaping from what? From everything I couldn't fix, he says honestly. I thought if I changed the scenery, things inside me would change too. And did they? She asks. He smiles softly. Not the way I expected. They move to the small couch near the window. Diep tucks her legs under herself, pulling a thin blanket around her shoulders. James sits beside her, close enough that their arms touch. Outside, the sky's dark now, clouds slowly drifting apart to reveal small patches of stars. I used to think, Diep says, staring out the window, that wanting to stay meant I wasn't brave enough to leave. James turns his head slightly toward her. What do you think now? I think staying can be brave too, sometimes even harder. He nods. I agree. Silence follows, not empty but full of things they don't need to say anymore. Later, Diep stands and walks toward the suitcase. She kneels beside it again, this time more deliberately. She takes out the scarf she'd seen earlier and folds it neatly, placing it back inside. Then she adds a small notebook, different from the one on the table. Its pages are blank. James watches her from across the room. "You're packing already?" he asks, not teasing, not serious. She shakes her head. "No, I'm just making space." "For what?" "For the version of us that's not rushing," she says quietly. He walks over and sits beside her on the floor. Together they look at the open suitcase. It doesn't look full. It doesn't look empty either. James reaches into a drawer nearby and pulls out an old photograph. It's creased at the edges, the colour's slightly faded. He holds it for a moment before placing it inside the suitcase, carefully. "What's that?" Diep asks. "A reminder," he says, "of where I started." She doesn't ask more, she understands. They zip the suitcase closed halfway this time, leaving it neither sealed nor open. James slides it gently back into the corner. Before bed, Diep writes one more line in the notebook on the table. "We go when we're ready to go together." She closes it and leaves it there. The next morning comes with sunlight instead of rain. The house feels lighter, as if it has exhaled. James steps outside early, breathing in the cool air. Diep joins him a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. They stand side by side on the small porch, watching the lights slowly move across the hills. "No rush," James says, almost to himself. Diep nods. "No rush." They spend the morning doing ordinary things, sweeping the floor, watering the plants, fixing a loose hinge on the door. Life continues, steady and familiar, but under the surface something has shifted. There's a quiet readiness, not loud enough to demand action, but strong enough to be felt. In the afternoon, James checks his camera again, adjusting the strap. Diep notices but doesn't comment. She organises papers on the table, stacking them neatly, then setting aside only what truly matters. They are both, in their own ways, learning how to leave space behind. As the sun lowers, they sit together once more. The map brought out again but not fully opened. James traces the folded edges with his finger. "Do you think we'll really do it?" he asks. Diep rests her head against his shoulder. "I think we already are." He smiles, understanding. They don't talk about dates or destinations. They don't promise anything dramatic. They simply stay there, holding on to the quiet certainty that when the time comes, they'll know. The suitcase waits, so does the road. And for now, that is enough.
Linda và Linda theo bà và cậu cháu ra nương mía dưới nắng sớm. Bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa, dạy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO quang ghế đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.